right. So I feel like, considering where we are right now, this is kind of a question that's important because we kind of do have to choose. And other times you might not have had to choose sides. This time you kind of do. And specifically, the choice is this: which straight white male president's line of thinking do you want to get behind? And I
Ooh, who are
know.
you going to pick?
I know. Well, okay, so here are your two options, right? On one hand, you have Abraham Lincoln, right, who, among other things, was president during the Civil War, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, was generally on the side of all, meaning all, right, when we think about the rights of all people. On the other side, right, you have Andrew Johnson, who you may think of him as the president who came after Lincoln. You may think of him as the reason why Confederate sympathizers just got to go back to their homes post-war and be like, so we lost, but it's cool. We still have everything. And we're just going to keep this white supremacy thing going in other ways. So that's the choice.
Wait. Be more clear. So the guy who believes that all people and really all should have all rights, and then the guy who basically thinks that rich white landowning males are the only ones who should really have rights. Did I say that
Yeah,
right?
probably straight rich,
right?
white
Oh,
males
yes.
too.
You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So that's your choice, right? And ultimately, this is kind of the question. That was probably the question, in the 1860s, but this is also the question right now in America in 2026.
So quick gut check. What's your answer? We're getting to have a fabulous conversation with a lawyer, a thinker, and an author, someone who really processes information deeply, systematically, and convincingly to capture your attention with boldness and walk you through some really great ways to take action. You're listening to the podcast, What Do You Mean by That? And we are your co-hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha.
I'm Steve Phillips, author of Are White Men Smarter Than Everybody Else? And I'm the founder of Democracy in Color. It's a political media organization.
Well, I'm glad you talked about your new book because you know that we love a good provocative title. And so we'd love to start with you telling us why you called your book what you did, or, as you put it, saying the quiet part out loud.
Well, originally, in some ways it's, I don't want to say unfortunately a trilogy, but it's like I have to keep writing the books, I have to keep trying to put this analysis and understanding out. And so the first book was Brown is the New White, was really trying to quantify, frankly, and contextualize the Obama coalition, what its implications were for the future of this country, because so many people were concluding that it's this aberration, this once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon, Obama's personal skills, et cetera, obviously, which he has, but not understanding that his victory was made possible by the demographic revolution in the country. And actually, I went back and ran the numbers. If Obama had run against Reagan and gotten the same percentage of each racial group that he got in '08, he would have lost. Because the country was not diverse enough yet for that coalition to actually comprise a majority of voters. So that was the point of that book. And then the second book was in the context of the first Trump administration. And then also, we did it in 2022, but then we had Biden and those victories. And so trying to understand that moment and really trying to start out metaphorically to explain that the Civil War had never ended. And so that's what how we win the Civil War. And then as I dug more into that, saw that it wasn't metaphorical at all. Right, that everybody knows, right, that Lincoln was assassinated, but I didn't even know until researching that Lincoln was assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer, white supremacist, who killed him 5 days after the supposed surrender at Appomattox. And so that's not surrendering at all. And so then you can see the continuity and the continuation of the resistance to making this country a multiracial democracy. So that was the point of that book. And so then the publisher came to me again, the New Press, originally looking at the commitments, what happened to the commitments people made around racial justice after George Floyd was killed. And so that was my original focus and framework. And I was going to call it, the files on my computer are still called, Does All Mean All? Right? So that, Declaration of Independence, Gettysburg Address, all are created equal. And so obviously there's a lot of affirmation of that view after George Floyd was killed during the whole racial reckoning. People rolled out these commitments and whatnot. And I mainly wanted to look at what happened to these commitments. Do we still believe that all means all? And then why are we not carrying forward in the work? So that was the original thrust. Then we have the 2024 election. Then we have the 2025 reality in terms of this administration and their attacks on all things, equity and social justice. And it's almost like a blitzkrieg of attacks on all of those different efforts. And so that's where I felt like two things. One was, well, for one, I do feel like there's like such an intensity of these attacks that I did feel that this moment demanded almost a commensurate response of sharpness and to the pointness and really trying to boil these things down. And then the other part is that they have, well, frankly, trying to be too clever by half. They're trying to use all these civil rights laws to be able to justify their attacks on civil rights. But in so doing, they've left standing the underlying laws and tried to go after the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, but that's a bit of a different point. But the underlying inequality, so they're trying to say, oh, you can't use this remedy. So they're going after all this attack, and DEI and affirmative action is about attacking and undermining and dismantling and getting rid of remedies to inequality. But they're not saying anything about the underlying inequality itself. And so that's where I wanted to force this question. Obviously, yes to the administration, but more to those who have backpedaled and abandoned the commitments that they had made earlier is, do you think you accomplished the job? And so this is getting to the quiet part out loud. And it really is fundamentally about trying to, like you're saying, say the quiet part out loud of what a lot of people who tolerate the level of inequality that we have won't say. And that's like, well, there is this gross, disparity, but it's because of this reason, or it's because of the failings. And so that's the strategic thrust of what I was trying to go for with this book, is to change the framework and to be able to try to have us go back on the offensive on racial justice, the way we were in 2020, 2021. This is a very different conversation. And I want to do that by trying to flip the framework from focusing on the underrepresentation of people of color and women to the overrepresentation of white men, which is a very different conversation. And so we're trying to lift up this concept we're calling straight white American male preference, which spells out swamp. And we want to it's a very different inquiry around, well, we can't find people of color, they don't have enough education, or their families aren't together, or they don't have mentors, or they don't want to go for positions, to why are you giving all the positions and all the money and all the power to white men? That's a different inquiry. And I think it helps us go on the offensive. And because I feel like, frankly, it's indefensible, truthfully, if we will ask the question around why does this state of affairs exist? And then we can get to discussing remedies and perhaps new remedies than the ones that we had previously been using.
Thank you. I love that you mentioned swamp, because I think that something that jumped out to both Sarah and me in this book was the swamp being the acronym for this, which is great. And also the concept of the swamp audit. We've had a couple conversations on the podcast, and in particular, I think about one with Lily Jing, where they noted that the only thing that sort of actually moved the needle in terms of creating and maintaining a more diverse workforce was quotas, and really looking at data and looking at who was actually in positions of power and who was overrepresented, and then moving forward from there. And so, when we were reading about swamp audits, I was thinking like this really echoes that concept in terms of using like real actual data, gathering that and pushing for change. So can you explain a little bit how this works, how you came up with this, and like how people can actually implement these?
So the fundamental numerical point of reference here is 29%, is that white men are 29% of the US population. And this is by the 2024 census data. And so this is the base. And so then the essence of a swamp audit is what percentage of whatever entity or organization or sector you're looking at what percent of that sector is made up of white men? And so if you're looking at the United States Congress, you're looking at CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, 90% of that sector are white men. You're looking at who's getting funding from venture capitalists in terms of startup companies, 90% of that is white men. That's dramatic overrepresentation. And so far more than the 29%. And so the concept of the swamp audit is simply to take that 29% lens and apply it to the organization, to a social sector, to a governmental body or whatnot, and see, is there overrepresentation or not of white men? And then to follow that with asking the question. And that's really what I'm pushing to do. And this is going back on the offensive, is that we've been very much on the defensive trying to defend the particular remedies that we've been pursuing, affirmative action, DEI, et cetera. And so people are saying, well, it has that bad effect or this unintended effect or whatnot. Let's, for the moment, concede the remedies, but let's get back to the problem. And so is there overrepresentation? And then why is that the case? And I want to force people to have that conversation and force them to think about why is that the case? Because you can only reach two conclusions. One is that there is, in fact, something wrong with the communities of color and women, and that white men are therefore smarter, more talented, more driven, and more deserving of being in these positions. That's the one school of thought or view, or the other is that there's actually preference being shown to white men. And you can only really arrive at those two conclusions, but we don't have the conversation and we don't ask the question. And that's what I'm trying to remedy.
I appreciate that so much. And this idea of remessaging and reframing the situation we're finding ourselves in feels like something that's really important. So I have a two-part question about this, because when we last interviewed you for how do we win the Civil War, on our emails, we got pushback being like, hey, I think this is a little outlandish with what you're saying. Like, you better be careful. And now this title is provocative as well. And here we are in 2026, and there is a lot of provocative stuff going on in the world right now, from our government all the way down. Do you think at this point in time, it does help to get people's attention to be this bold? Or do you think it is closing the door? A lot of people are afraid of being bold, and they say, well, it's going to close down the conversation for people because they're afraid of this backlash and we want to tiptoe around it. And so I'm curious what you found with the prior book and what you're expecting with this title.
Right. Well, I think there was some level of pushback with the first book with the prior book as well. But I would think that looking back on it now, I think people would actually see that this notion, we have unapologetic leaders who are quite literally apologetic for the Confederacy within this country, to say nothing of actually actively working to dismantle all of the efforts to make this a multiracial democracy. And so the framing of the Civil War never ending and of the modern day Confederates carrying on that work, I think has only been affirmed through actions and history and what has transpired. And so I'm glad you asked the question about this, Stephen Crowley. So you asked about why I had titled this way, because I strongly believe we need to have a conversation and a referendum in this country around what kind of country we are, that we actually have. And so that means we have to be bold and invite the conversation and even invite the conflict to face these questions. And this notion about like, oh, it's too much, or we should be, less direct. And I even found this. I've talked to different people as we were putting together a book. There's like, oh, well, this is very controversial, et cetera. And pointing out inequality should not be more controversial than perpetuating the actual inequality. But fundamentally, this is in the context of a period in time, because even where we're at, that's why I'm framing this and drawing the connection to the George Floyd racial reckoning piece. That was 2020, 2021. And then you started seeing the backtracking and the distancing, and Walmart going from big public pronouncements and a $100 million racial justice center to wiping that from their website and eliminating that endeavor as just one example. That all predated the 2024 election and the arrival of this administration. And so that's an important point for us to realize. But what has happened is because this administration came in so aggressively, that people have drawn wrong conclusions around what happened in 2024 and the level of support for the attacks that are coming currently out of Washington, D.C. And they've misinterpreted also the 2024 election. And so there's this viewpoint that this current direction, this current hostility towards diversity is the majority view in this country. And that therefore what we need to do is to be more timid and pull back and figure out how are we going to actually change people's minds who are against us on these issues. And I believe that's an incorrect reading of the electorate. It's an incorrect reading of the math of what happened in 2024. Fundamentally, what happened is that there was a lower turnout of the multiracial new American majority than there was of those who wanted to go more in the MAGA direction, which is a different point than all of these people switch their views to oppose multiracial democracy. So that's where I feel like we have to force this conversation and force people to choose and to take a stand. We need to have a referendum in this country around what is this country. And I do believe that is have the majority support for that if we will articulate it, fight for it, champion it, and summon people to take a stand around it.
I hear you on that. And I hope that is the case. But if you take a step back and look at the political world, the Democratic messaging and the doingness is lacking. There's a lot of listening and learning, and we're at the point where we need to see more action. We can all take action in these little slivers of our society. Is that better or worse? Like, is it hurting the efforts to have all of these smaller fractured organizations doing this work compared to like the Democratic Party actually taking this on as one big powerhouse of change? And if it's impossible for the Democratic Party to be that party, what does the solution look like?
Well, there were the two or three different questions, right, in terms of how those different pieces come together, right? I mean, I've talked regularly about the formative political experience of my life. I mean, quite literally a child of the civil rights movement, right? Born in the 1960s, my family desegregated our neighborhood in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. My brother was the first Black student at local elementary school. One of my first memories was going to see Martin Luther King when he came to Cleveland. I was 3 or 4 years old. And as always, you're interested in politics and in social change. So all of that came together for me in 1984 when Jesse Jackson ran for president. And so that model, that formation, that experience has been formative for me. And so now I'm also feeling and experiencing profoundly the absence of that voice, that leadership, that coalition, that, small R rainbow coalition. And yet that remains the majority of people. I mean, Jesse used to talk about when the old minorities come together, they comprise a new majority. And so this is where I think we need to be going. And in terms of like looking at even the election results, it's been underappreciated what happened in 2025. And so we look at 2024, people feel like the MAGA forces, they don't want the diversity, et cetera. But 2025 was a profound repudiation of the direction of this administration and what's coming out of Washington, D.C. and across the country, from the California redistricting piece even to like Georgia and Mississippi, there were elections, and then Virginia, New Jersey, and most high profile New York. And we have failed to appreciate the significance of what happened in New York with Mamdani's victory. And you have somebody who is an unapologetic, progressive person of color, democratic socialist, Muslim, all the things they said Obama was, but was not, Mamdani is, right? And he did not apologize. And he put forward a bold vision for what this country should be and where we should go, what our priorities should actually be, and attracted large numbers of people into the process and won the election and overcame the establishment forces. So that to me is the model. And that's what really gives me hope. And so, no, it's not coming from the Democratic Party. And far too many people in the Democratic Party remain far too timid. And frankly, I've been saying for a decade now, far too bad at math. And so they draw the wrong conclusion on what the composition of the electorate is and what the path to victory is. So it's not going to be there. Like Reverend Jaskin's talking about. And so I was talking with, Stacey Abrams, had a long-term partnership with her. She's been doing a lot of this work through American Pride Rising around continuing to make the case for DEI, continuing to make the case for this being a multiracial democracy. And so she's been talking about in the tech world and entrepreneurial world, they talk about minimum viable product. Stacey's like, what's the minimum viable community that you can actually come together with people and even encourage these kind of swamp audits? Can you get 3 to 4 people to come together who are in an organization? And then can those 3 to 4 people then go to that organization, whether it's a school or a school district or your job, and ask, are white men overrepresented? And what are we doing about it? And so those types of local efforts and endeavors ultimately stitched together is what we need to do. But I think it's not going to come from the current leadership of the Democratic Party in any shape or fashion. My hope is that kind of local effort all over the country can begin to congeal and come together in the context of a 2028 candidacy, as well as probably like state and local advocacies. So where there's a strong, compelling, completely different, forceful, and more positive restructuring, rebuilding agenda than you currently see from the mainstream Democratic leadership. So one thing I didn't say about the thing about the Democratic Party, so it's not monolithic. And so I do think there's a piece about trying to find those leaders who are in the Democratic Party and who have a clearer, sharper vision around what should be done differently, and to get behind those people to elevate them to have a bigger voice. And so, I mean, I mentioned Mamdani certainly is one, different people in Congress. I mean, most famous probably, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, been a clear, unapologetic, strong, progressive voice for a different kind of country. And so backing her, supporting her leadership, following her, amplifying her voice. I'm out here in California in the Bay Area, and so there's Latifah Simon is now a congresswoman from the Oakland area. This is the seat that Barbara Lee held when Barbara Lee was the sole vote, right, against going to war back, 20 years ago. And it's the seat that Ron Dellums had when he was the champion of ending the Vietnam War and of peace within this country. And Latifah has stepped into that role and is playing an increasingly significant role in the national dialogue around, again, an unapologetic, bold, far-reaching social justice agenda, supporting those kinds of people and supporting even overall the Progressive Caucus in Congress, right? Greg Casar out of Texas and leading that effort. And so that's helping that sector become more influential in the Democratic Party is going to be an important part. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that was the vision and the direction what we were trying to do with the Rainbow Coalition, is to take that coalition and to be able to get into greater influence and in the party overall. It's almost like forcing them to do right, even if they don't see right themselves. So that, I think, is a big part of it. And then the other part is I do think that these local efforts can make a bigger difference. Like I was in the school board in San Francisco. That was my, much of my initial entry to elected office. And you saw there that just getting like 5 or 10 people to show up at a school board meeting had an impact on the board in terms of being able to, people care about this issue. They want to be able to move pieces. You can ask the question, what are you doing about the education, the racial achievement gap within the school district? How are you actually allocating the money? What percentage of the contracts are going to people from different backgrounds? Showing up and asking those questions, a small grouping of people can have a much bigger influence in that local level than they would realize. And then we now live in a technological age and world. I mean, I keep dating myself with technology, but I brought a typewriter to college when I came to college. I used to work for the Cleveland Plain Dealer in the 1980s when the reporters would type their stories up on a typewriter, pull the piece of paper out, bring it over to me. I was a copy boy. I'd put it in a pneumatic tube, shoot it upstairs where it'd get physically laid out, printed out on these big, massive printing presses, put on trucks, and then drove it around the city and delivered to people. That's how we got our news. That's how we got connected back in the day. So that's all of these tools we have now, is that so these local efforts can be connected instantly via these online platforms that we have. And so it's, yes, focusing locally. I think that's where you get deeper relationships and you can know people and, go deeper there. But now we can all be connected in our particular local pods all over the country. And then that can become a powerful force for social change.
I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you have highlighted that the combination of hyper-local efforts, but the ability to still remain connected with all of these local efforts. Because I think people sometimes think, well, if it's local, then it's a small thing. And I think that misstates or kind of mischaracterizes the purpose of local action, especially when you think how connected we are. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm also glad you brought up the school board, because education is something that Sarah and I talk a lot about. And for us, like, it is really the foundation of equity for all. And I think we've seen, especially in this administration, where we have spent as much money with Iran as we could, to fund sort of universal kindergarten for everyone. And there is a clear choice being made by this administration day after day to dismantle quality education, higher education, to challenge ways to even have education in this country. So, can you talk a little bit about why this seems so important for this administration and your thoughts about it?
Well, yes, it's knowledge and understanding is critical to being able to impact. I mean, the essence of a democracy is that you need an informed electorate. And so you have people who have interest, and you choose your leaders to then go represent the interest of the society overall. That also has to be premised upon good information and good knowledge of what's actually going on. And so much of the history of repression, authoritarianism, dictatorship is been accompanied by taking over the means of communication, shutting down and homogenizing the education process to where it becomes indoctrination, so that people do not have a clear understanding and picture. And at the end of the day, not the end of the day, but the essence of what happened in 2020. And I still remember when my wife saw the video, what happened to George Floyd. She's like, it was so visceral, because so much of what happens in our society is denial. And it's like, well, it's not really that bad, or this doesn't really happen. And so that's a lot of ways we stop people from becoming active, is by giving them a distorted picture, hiding what's actually happening, et cetera. And what the racial reckoning that happened after George Floyd's murder revealed is that if you give people actual information and you show them what is actually happening, they will then act to change things and improve it. And so what was so significant there was there's no way you could deny what was actually happening there. And so you can't claim like, oh, well, he had a gun or he did whatever. It's like they put this man on the ground, put their knee on his neck casually. And so when people saw that, they went into action and they demanded great and significant change. And so that's a microcosm of what's more largely going on in terms of understanding what's going on. I remember when I went to college, I was like trying to understand, as an African-American man in this country, why was this inequality? Where did it come from? Where are the responses? How are the ways to actually go about changing it? And so it somewhat ties back to what I'm trying to do with the book around reorienting to the systemic problems rather than blaming the individuals. And so it's like, what's your level of understanding around why there is inequality? And you get this through study, you get this through inquiry, you get this through reading books and being able to do critical thinking around. I was telling someone this the other day about when Ben Carson, the African-American surgeon, ran for president in it was 2016. And he liked to try to say this as, well, my mom was poor, and so she didn't rely on government handouts, et cetera. And so they kind of, cherry picked this one little point to try. And I always wanted to ask him, why was your mom poor? How did she get poor? Was it like was she wealthy at one point and then she like squandered the money through bad choices and blowing it on drugs or whatever? Or was she born into poverty? And then why was your African-American mother born into poverty? And what does that go back to? And so when you start having that level of critical thinking, you pretty quickly get to the systemic problems within this country, that then they require systemic solutions that would have to change the balance of power in ways that the current people in power don't like. And so that's what the education system at its best can do. And that's why they are trying to dismantle as much of it as possible.
And I feel like the challenges are just going to get worse as we feel the effects of the draining of like the funding for it. Then you have social media and the forces of AI, like you said, videos and this empathy that is and this feeling that are elicited by seeing things as they really are going to be muddied when people use new tools to create and try to mess with people's understanding of reality. So I guess I have a question for you then, because I didn't want to be like sad talking about education. What gives you hope? There was a part in the book when you said you really pointed out that Trump and his administration have, at least until now, been unwilling and unable to convince the country that that inequality is okay, right? Like they haven't said those words that like we need to be run by straight white men. And so it's tacitly acknowledging that we have a multiracial majority. That gave me hope. I was kind of like, oh, maybe if I can. So what else are you seeing right now that gives you some hope?
Yeah, I think that that's an important point to emphasize is that they can't bring themselves to say that this inequality is because white men are smarter. And so the underlying vulnerability of the status quo endures and that gives me confidence that if we ask the question, it's an indefensible situation. And then you have to move towards, okay, what are we going to do about it? But we haven't had that discussion. This entire discourse since 2021, really starting with CRT and then moving to the Students for Affirmative Action attacks and then this administration, has all been laser focused on a remedy or some of the remedies. And so this remedy is bad or that remedy is bad. But if we pull back and say, well, what about the problem? You can't say the problem doesn't exist. And so that gives me hope that the fact that they have really conceded some of that argument gives me hope in that regard. The thing that one of the things that gives me the most hope is really 2025's electoral results. Is that it's underappreciated. People keep talking, they talk about it like in some of the media pieces about like, oh, well, they've, some level of overperformance or some level of swing or whatnot. The meta narrative has been missing, that there has been a national repudiation and rejection of the policies, priorities, and direction of this administration. And you have seen it really across the board in places that you have been surprised to see it. And that's also why they are so obsessed with trying to distort and suppress the vote heading towards the midterms. It's because they know that that if the natural course of things, they will lose power and that the balance of power will begin to be restored. So the trend is very much in our favor in terms of, and then looking at all the massive protests, the No Kings, rallies, et cetera, is that people are rejecting what this administration is trying to do. There has not been a referendum in this country that this is the kind of country we want to be. And to the extent that they're trying to manifest it, people are saying no. And I think I would argue that the evidence shows that the majority of people are saying no. So fundamentally, that gives me hope that we have this majority. If we can organize it, mobilize it, and manifest its power, we should be able to take back our country and begin to rebuild something that is far more aligned with our values and our vision of what we have wanted to see.
Thank you, because I also needed that hope. And, I really appreciate that because I think it also looks at the much longer game that exists here, right? Like you point this out in the book too. And we've talked to people who have talked about sort of going 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And, there is a pattern to this, but in the end, because of who we are, we have this chance to have the country that we believe in. And, I want to ask about Project 2126, which you talk about towards the end of the book, because I loved how you talked about you were going to have that be Project 2029. But then you were like, no, we need a much longer vision. I was 100% for that because I think on the podcast, Sarah and I have spent a lot of time talking about how the Republicans have been really great at the long game. Like when you think about the 50 years between Roe v. Wade and Dobbs and, just so many examples of like really playing the long game to get to where they want to go. And conversely, how the Democratic Party has been pretty terrible at that and very reactive as a result. So I would love for you to share more about this vision, this project 100 years out.
Yes. And so thank you for asking that. So Trump came into office and they signed those executive orders and they did the executive order on doing affirmative action. I had 2 thoughts. One was, because these are like, they've been 60 years old. The executive orders were passed establishing affirmative action 60 years before. And so one was that, well, these lasted for 60 years, which is not a small amount of time. But the other was that clearly they had not fully done the job, that we had not achieved equality yet, despite the 60 years of doing this. And so then that would lead me to think about like, well, if we had some policy that made some progress and was good for 60 years, and that's now gone, what are we going to do for the next 60 years? And who's actually thinking about that and putting those in place and putting those in place in ways that would be even better and even more effective than what we had not done before. Because there's one thing that this administration has done, which I think all political leaders should take note of, is to show what's possible with an aggressive, unapologetic, bold policy vision. Now, unfortunately, theirs is to move in a more Confederate direction, but you can't say they haven't been effective in wielding power. And so then what are we doing as we prepare to take back power to then use it in terms of building for the next period in time? So that's where I got to in the book. Because originally I was like, all right, everyone who talked about Republicans had Project 2025. And so we need to Project 2029. But that what happened, Project 2025 was 40 years in the making. I mean, it actually started in 1979 when the Heritage Foundation was preparing for Ronald Reagan's election. And they did this 800-page book, which I bought a copy of on eBay, Mandate for Change. And they have it in the office. They had it in the offices of all these different people in the Reagan administration, the cabinet officers and the White House staff and whatnot. And Project 2025 was just building on that. So that was a 40-plus year piece. And so this is, I think, both the challenge and the opportunity for this moment is that who is thinking about it? And we need to be thinking about what is going to be an agenda and a public policies and a direction that will then take us certainly through the rest of this century, because this is the time frame that we're even actually been operating in. And I think that what the other lesson is that there's an appetite for that, is people want there to be. And so much of democratic politics has been timidity and not trying to alienate any particular entity, afraid you're going to lose supporters rather than championing a bold, aggressive vision. And just what you see on the other side, they're just doing whatever without actually losing any support. And that's what I'm saying. We learn from, I've learned from the Mondani example, that if you put forward a strong policy agenda, inspire people, engage people, it's a winning formula. And that you have more people actually come up supportive of you, and then you can actually do more. And so that to me is where this moment really is that we have the numbers not only to take back power, but that to put forward a policy agenda and a vision and a restructuring of our society. People talk about a third reconstruction that would really manifest our full values, not have our public policies be a series of compromises with people who are opposed to us. But if we really believe in multiracial democracy, what does that look like? What does it look like in terms of everybody voting? And what does it look like in terms of the richest country in the history of the world, making sure that nobody lives in poverty? All of that is within our reach if we have the vision and the tenacity and the belief to move it forward. But I believe the numbers manifest this if we have the leadership and the commitment to be able to do it.
Ooh, that's kind of exciting to think about it. I want to ask a clarifying question then, because you mentioned earlier AOC, some of the more, and we're talking about a bold vision. And when I hear those words, I think about the extremes, right? I think about like the MAGA stuff on one hand, but then I think about AOC and like the socialism word that people are so afraid of. And are you thinking, because I feel like a lot of the moderate has been this constant compromise. Are you talking about much bolder policies also, like universal healthcare and education? Like, is it time that we start embracing the other extreme in order to push forward this vision? Or is there any other option? And I guess because the other part that I think about extremes is so many people are like, oh, this woman candidate could be. Personally, I'm like, I don't know that we're ready. Like, we've just rolled back so many rights for women. Are we really ready for a female candidate? But is that perhaps more fear-based and not thinking boldly enough? So I would just love your initial thoughts on that.
Yes, well, just to that last point, I think a lot of women are ready for women candidates, and women are the majority of people in the country and in the electorate. So when people say that, like, we're not ready, like, which we are we actually talking about? Now, it is a issue which has not received sufficient attention that kind of, bafflingly to me, is that this current man in the White House has run for president 3 times, twice against a woman, once against a man. And that there's been almost no analysis of the realities of sexism, misogyny, implicit bias in that regard on the electorate. Everyone's talking about, it's the price of eggs and, inflation, et cetera, which are factors. But what about sexism? Wasn't that a factor, the most obvious piece here? And there's not enough attention and focus around understanding and then redressing that situation. So that is definitely needs to be high on the social change agenda. But just mathematically, I actually believe that the numbers remain there if we would lean into that. And so then that's the other piece to me is that I almost want to ask a lot of them. The moderates rarely say people should be poor or they shouldn't have good housing or they shouldn't have health care. What they say is, well, if we push for those things, we'll lose support, which is a different statement than a value statement. And I want to ask them, do you think that we should live in a society where there is not poverty? I mean, I once gave a talk like 10 years ago in California. It's like if you did I think it was like a 1% wealth tax on just the billionaires in the state, you could end hunger in California. And so who would be against that? Right? And it's like, what support are we going to actually lose? And I think the other part of that is that the underappreciated lesson of what Mandami has done in New York is that these things go together. And you put forward a bold public policy agenda that we should have childcare for everybody, that it brings more people into the process and it strengthens your political coalition and it strengthens the force behind your policy agenda. And so we absolutely need to be, particularly in the context of the level of attack and destruction that this current administration has done, going after the 14th Amendment itself in terms of who gets to be an American. If we put forward an agenda that says this is the greatest, certainly the wealthiest and most powerful country in the history of the world, why can't we feed everybody, house everybody, give everybody a guaranteed income make sure that they don't actually live in poverty so that everybody can flourish to the full extent of their talents and abilities? It's within our reach. It's within our economic capacity if it's within our vision and within our commitment. And I think these things go together. By putting forward that kind of agenda, we'll bring forward additional enthusiasm, support, and power to be able to both win and then govern and make the changes that we want to see.
I appreciate that. And I hope that that would galvanize people like the stories I hear from my white friends in Utah who in checkout line overheard the woman say, well, my husband votes for our family. I don't do that. And so, yes, the numbers are there, but what are the barriers keeping people from, as we've talked about ad nauseum, like showing up and to use that ability? What else didn't we ask that you would like for our listeners to know?
Well, I sometimes like to ask, like, what would we do if we knew we wouldn't lose? Like, what policy would we put forward? What kind of agenda in society would we actually advance? And we don't, too much of politics is, and certainly on the progressive side, is limited by fear. And with that fear is undergirded by bad math. And so I'm trying to convey to people is that we need to have more confidence and more assertiveness around putting forward what we actually want this country to be like, what we want our society to be like, who we want to be as people. And that linked to that, and I've been studying and talking about and writing about these numbers for, well over a decade now, and they've only gotten more in our favor. The country in the 1960s was 12% people of color. And this was when Lyndon Johnson went before Congress, summoned people to a great society, said, we shall overcome. The country is now 41% people of color. And the history of the political struggle in this country has been, historically, politics was a contest between white people. And you had conservative whites battling it out with liberal whites over the whites in the middle. And that's how politics functioned for most of the country's history up until 60s, 70s, and 80s, when you actually changed the immigration laws to stop having a whites-only immigration policy, and we had the Voting Rights Act to transform the composition of the electorate. So now this has been the through line of the work I've been trying to lay out, that progressive whites allied with people of color are the majority of people within this country. And yet we have not reoriented our strategic thinking in this regard. And so I think that failure to appreciate our power is what has allowed too many people to capitulate to the attacks on diversity. So that's why I'm trying to get us back to that foundational question of How do we explain this? Are you saying that white men are smarter? And if you can't get yourself to say that, then let's get ourselves together, manifest our power to create a society that has preferences for none and justice for all.
Love it. Thank you so much. All right. People are going to want to go and buy the book. Where can they find it and you?
democracyincolor.com. We have a weekly newsletter. People can go sign up for our newsletter there. We have a podcast comes out every 2 weeks. And so that way to most stay in touch with what we're actually doing. And the book is available everywhere. And then we have different links actually on my website, stevephillips.com.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to What Do You Mean by That? A show dedicated to being better humans and getting loud for all of us. Hat tip to Sarah's daughter for the logo, and huge thanks to Misasha's son for our incredible theme music. Find out more and subscribe to our newsletter at whatdoyoumeanbythat.com. Because as always, it's all of us or it's none of us.